All right, so basically what the introduction is, I think it's the most like important part of the entire speech, right? Many people say this is like arguably the most important part of the speech, but I say this is the singular most important part of the speech. Because first impressions matter a whole lot more than you may think, right? Speech and debate is an activity where like ideally the judge is like impartial and like judges based off your content and your speaking ability and stuff like that. But more often than not, like they have subconscious like aspects to like their rankings, right? Because if some person's like presents themselves better in like a better package, then like that'll be someone who does better in a round. And like you could see that if you like watch a final round without volume, you can oftentimes tell who's like the better one in the round just by that. Um, and so because of that, you can oftentimes like um give yourself a huge advantage by like strategically placing the introduction in a way that like you have an AGD like makes you a likable speaker from the start, and then B, as you develop your content, your introduction to really set the path in order for your job to be made easier there. All right. So what we're gonna do is first we're gonna watch an introduction. All right. Can everyone see my screen? All right.
Is that
Um,
Tanner?
yeah, this is Tanner Jones. He got second at Nats 2018, I think. I don't know the exact year, but yeah, this is like most people call this like textbook extemp. I think that's what Brian called it last week. It's like um, his introduction is like textbook, like going through every single part. He does like I think he messes up the naming of the question, but like that's fine. The idea here is try to like find an outline for the intro. So what I want you guys to do is like try to find an outline that he uses in terms of like what's the structure. So for those of you that don't know like the general outline, try to find one, and then we'll talk about it after. All right. Let's start watching. Oh, never mind. Okay, yeah, there we go.
In his magnum opus, The Art of the Deal, U.S. President Donald Trump signaled that masterful deal-making is the best way to deal with any situation. But now that he's in the White House, it seems that the president is pursuing a different course, namely the art of leaving a deal. James Hohman, a writer for the Washington Post and a former U.S. Extemp national champion, pointed out on May 10th of this year that recently the U.S. president failed to renew the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a deal that was put into place in 2015 under the Obama administration and reduced sanctions towards Iran. In return, Iran pledged to stop nuclearizing towards reaching a nuclear weapon, and in fact, allowed inspectors on a routine basis to check their nuclear facilities to ensure that they were in fact complying. With the United States no longer part of the deal, it seems that the course is in fact changing. And with the event of a nuclear war, in fact being harmful to every single human being on Earth, it's critical that we ask, will President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, how will it impact U.S. relations with Iran? The answer is that it will lead the relationship to deteriorate, as it will embolden Iran's regime. And it will do so in three ways. First, by pushing Iran to nuclearize. Second, by radicalizing the citizens of Iran. And finally, by harming U.S. strategic relationships. Nobody wants a new.
All right. So did anyone catch like a general structure that was used in that introduction?
It was like AGD, and then he like linked to the AGD with that. He linked the AGD to context with an article, and then like more background, and then same as significance, and then the thesis.
Yeah. Does everyone agree with that?
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the AGD first. That's like the first thing in an introduction that you want. It's an attention-getting device, right? Think about judge's perspective. You're watching an extemp round, right? I know a ton of judges that like say, "Oh no, I have to judge extemp this round." Right? That's the round where like they're bored because they're just presented and inundated with information on like politics and stuff like that, and it's like what you want to do is spice up their like round, right? So you go up there and present your AGD. It should be something that makes them laugh and makes them excited to watch a speech finally, right? Oftentimes extemporaneous can get boring. And so like AGDs can like make that a way to like not only put your personality into a joke, but like and like get that into the speech, but also like make sure that it wakes judges up and make sure that they're paying attention. And like that's where you're getting their attention. That's why it's called the attention getting device. All right. So most often it's like a little joke. I just put that word for word because it is what it is. As you saw in Tanner's little an, introduction, he had a joke about like the art of the deal, but he left the Iran nuclear deal. So you basically have to just like get like a short line. I've heard a lot of coaches say like you don't necessarily have to be a stand-up comedian. You can just be clever, right? If you can come up with clever statements, then you can just get the job done here and get their attention in the first place. Now, the other aspect to like not having to be a stand-up comedian, Brian said this last week, and I think it's like the like most evident when you like listen to like HEDs that are centered around like news headlines and stuff like that. And so like you don't have to be a stand-up comedian because if you're not funny or like you don't think you're funny, then you can realize like the world is pretty funny, right? You'll find some headlines that are funny, you'll find some events that are funny. Like, you know, um like I think a year or two ago, they had like the big baby blow up doll of like Donald Trump in like the UK. And that was like something that was funny, and you could just use that as like part of your AGD. So you don't necessarily have to be cracking jokes left and right and like coming up with like jokes on your own to be successful and have a good AGD. But it's something to be aware of that you can just like make fun of the world. And some good sources for that I was going to mention is like it's a Reddit page called Not the Onion. So r/Not the Onion. That's based off like the satirical website The Onion, which is also like a good website for like finding like some jokes. But also like late night talk shows like The Daily Show, The Tonight Show. I don't think The Tonight Show does a lot actually, but like Stephen Colbert does a lot. Um, Seth Meyers does a lot. John Oliver, of course, does like these deep topic discussions with like jokes on those. Patriot Act by Hassan Minaj, he does great stuff. So yeah, these are great shows you can watch not only to like educate yourself and find like a more common perspective on like an issue, but also like it'll give you a lot of good AGD ideas. And what you have to do in these AGDs is not necessarily like give the credit to these comedians, right? Um, no judge is gonna call you out for like saying a joke that a comedian did, and like they're not gonna be like give credit to it because it's like a common joke, right? A lot of these comedians actually use the same jokes, so there's that. You don't have to be like Stephen Colbert said. You can just say the joke and get a laugh out of it, and it's no big deal. And then the other thing is it's not appropriate to joke in some situations. So like, can anyone think of a situation where like jokes might not be the most effective AGD?
I had a question about depression.
Yeah, so like that's not exactly a good thing to joke about. Anyone else?
Like a topic on like Syria or Yemen.
Yeah, I mean like Syria is like pretty severe. Although like Assad is like a topic some people like to joke about, like dictator. But Yemen is definitely one where it's like I stay away from jokes there. Typically, what you want there is like a statistic, right? Like a statistic is like X people like have been displaced, something like that. Or I'll talk about this at the end. You can set up a narrative. Um, so be careful not to be offensive. This kind of goes with like the not appropriate joke all the time. Like you could have something that like um, prison reform or like social issues sometimes jokes don't really go well with. So like um try to find a joke that like works well, but if it's offensive or you're treading the line or like you're on the line, right? Make sure that like you don't cross it. So like instead try to find a story or like a personal example of someone else, like not like a personal example of yourself that's like in an article or something. You can be like X person was like found out some family member passed away. I remember using this for like a Yemen speech by finding their like remains outside after a drone strike. Like that's just something that'll like sure it's not funny to change up the tone of a round, but like that's something that will get your judge's attention because look, that's a very severe issue. And that'll help you actually set up your context and like significance for the question, which we'll talk about later. So setting up a narrative is like, you talk about one personal example that you found in an article or something like that, and then you refer back to like that like narrative that you set up, right? So you can talk about like maybe a rural population in the United States when you're talking about an economic issue. Of like most often in econ, you'll just have a joke, but let's say for example you use like a rural population as like some huge problem they're having as your AGD. You might want to like refer back to that rural population not only in the end of your conclusion but also like throughout your points like while you're transitioning. And that seems to be very effective. Any questions on the AGD or the attention getting device?
No.
All right, cool. Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is pretty basic, but this is where we get into like really the big part of the introduction, which is like I'd say like 60% of extempers don't get this right. And this is like especially for the people who are like newer. And like once you like get this down, I feel like not only is it effective for the judge to understand in terms of like clarity and stuff like that, but it also makes sure that you can give an effective speech. And I'll get into that as we go through this slide. Okay, so first thing is like the link. I think someone mentioned that, like the link between the AGD and the context. Like you can't just say a random joke like, oh, President Trump is orange. Let's talk about the Yemeni civil war, right? Like that does not make sense. So you can't you have to make sure you have a logical transition and make sure you like have an AGD that has a logical transition. I think that goes in part with like planning what you're going to say for your AGD, not so much as like you're coming up with the link or the transition right when you say your speech. So make sure you have a logical link as Tanner did, like just citing an article that like relates leaving the deal to like what's happening now. And then you have to define all the terms in your question. We'll practice with this in a second, but you have a question like how will the United States leaving the Iran nuclear deal impact relations with Iran, right? You want to define what is the Iran nuclear deal. Define any term or any piece of legislation, any deal, any politician, any country that a judge might be unfamiliar with, right? So Tanner did a great job of defining the Iran nuclear deal, a joint comprehensive plan of action being established under the Obama administration, which like lifted sanctions off the country to make sure that they weren't nuclearizing. And like that was a pretty good explanation because that's like the concise, clear way to do it. And you want to have like one sentence at most for like each term you're defining, unless it's like one big term that you have to define. Then you have to give yourself like a framework of some sort, right? In some questions, you'll have vague wording that could be defined in one way or another depending on how you look at it. And so what your job as the person who's answering the question is to explain to the judge, look, I'm defining my question's terms as this, right? If my question is who would make the greatest pick for vice president, or like who would make the greatest vice presidential pick for Joe Biden in the 2020 election, right? I would define what is what would make a good pick, right? Like the question is asking that, but what does good mean in this scenario, right? And so in my introduction, I might say a sentence. In this case, a good vice presidential pick for Joe Biden would be the vice presidential pick, which allows him to get more votes in the 2020 election, or the most votes, right? What you can do that way is set up your entire speech to focus on one thing. And it's broad question on like what makes a good candidate. Every single candidate has good qualities to them, which is why they're being considered right now in the mainstream media and by Joe Biden. But if you strategically frame your question around maximizing voter turnout for Biden, you could then focus your speech around, look, this vice presidential candidate is only going to increase votes for Joe Biden and take votes away from Trump or something like that, right? That way you have something to relate back to and come back to that every single time at the end of your points. All right, does that make sense? Okay. After that, we'll give the background of the situation. This one kind of made sense. I mean, Tanner did this. He was talking about how the United States is no longer in the deal and like it somewhat delegitimizes it. Context is just that, a background explaining what is going on, why is it happening, and that's instead of definitions, that's what you would do for like a Yemen civil war question. You would say like, the Yemeni civil war started in 2015 when Houthi rebel separatists started fighting against the Yemeni government in order to form a different, you know, country, and they're separating from them. So you explain like why that happened, what like developments led to it happening, and what it's leading to. And basically, what you want to do is make sure you're not straying too far away from the question, right? Make sure that you're still trying to stay in the realm of the question and only give the information that's relevant to the question. Because if you're at the point where you're giving irrelevant information, your introduction is going to be too long, which you want to make it around a minute and 30 seconds, and it's just going to be too repetitive to follow. And then this is the most important part of the introduction, the context by far, because not only do you define the terms to improve the clarity in the judge's mind, you're able to like go through your own logical reasoning, right? When you draw a question, you think this is how I'm going to answer it because this is what the question is asking. If that question is asking something that could be up for debate, this context is where you really narrow it down and show your judge this is why this matters, this is why this doesn't. And so we'll go into that in a second. All right, let's practice. So let's start with the first question. Will Bashar al-Assad win Syria civil war? Who wants to identify what we would define there?
I can do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Who is Bashar al-Assad? What is the deal of Syria civil war?
Yeah, and then something I'd note here is like, what do you define as a win? Okay, like win would be like end the Syrian civil war and like take it over, or like you could strategically define, again, like going back to that framework that you could set up, you could strategically define a win for Bashar al-Assad as just gaining more territory or not losing his territory he has right now because he has a majority. So if you define Bashar al-Assad winning Syria civil war, a win for him is just blank, blank, blank. You could more easily make a speech about Bashar al-Assad not losing territory rather than make an argument about how Assad is going to take over the entire country. All right, the next one is, would Medicare for all improve America's healthcare system? What would we define there?
I can do this one.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
you have to define what Medicare for all is and
Absolutely.
explain the current situation of the American healthcare system.
Yeah, so explain Medicare for all again, one sentence at most, like Medicare for all would be a system in which the government takes out all private insurers out of the equation and puts every American into the same Medicare pool that is typically used for retirees, something like that, or like you throw in the word like single payer in there. And what you would do to like highlight the improve America's healthcare system is, yeah, you say like, what's the problem with America's healthcare system right now? And for example, you'd be like, Medicare for all would improve America's healthcare system if it improves the accessibility, because like, let's say like the quality of care is already good in America, something like that. So you'd have to define like what would mark an improvement. All right, next is, has globalization improved the lives of the world's poorest citizens?
I'll take that one. You would have to define globalization, and I think you could provide context on what improved would mean under like for the world's poor citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. And then like maybe like give a quick example of like what the world's poorest citizens are considered, right? Like below the poverty line, which is X amount. But yeah, those were the key ones. And then, are protectionist or free trade policies better for the average American worker? Anyone want to take that one?
All right, I'll take this one.
Okay.
So you'd have to define what a protectionist policy and what a free trade policy is. And you'd also have to explain what the current state of the average American worker and what are the deficits that are present.
Yeah. What would make it better too? That's like, I guess part of that. All right, that will go through like these quickly. Is there momentum to structurally change the Supreme Court by size and tenure? What would you define there?
Size, tenure, Supreme Court.
Yeah, tenure, Supreme Court, size. Like, what does it mean to change it by size and tenure? One other thing I define is like, what is momentum, right? Like, what do you consider like, is there enough momentum for something? So that's something interesting that you might want to talk about. Because you do not want the judge leaving your introduction confused on like what the question could be asking. And I know you didn't write the question, but since you're the one answering it, you get to be the one that interprets it. Okay, what lessons can be learned from Sweden's response to COVID-19? I think this is a topic in our draw yesterday.
What is
Probably
Sweden's
like,
response to
oh yeah.
COVID-19?
Okay, yeah, COVID-19. I mean, like define COVID-19. What was Sweden's response? Yeah, that was another one I heard. And then like, um, yeah, that's pretty much it. And then like, will states be able to recoup tax losses due to COVID-19? What were the tax losses? How many were there? Like, give examples of states. What would it mean to like recoup tax losses? Like, you could define technically like, not like getting it all back, but like maybe like minimizing the losses, something like that. Should the Fed continue to cut interest rates? How about this one?
Explain what the Fed does, how interest rates are impacted, and what are they currently at right now.
Yeah, that's a key actually. So defining what the interest rates right now at, um, how interest rates are impacted, would be like, I guess like it's kind of self-explanatory because they would be cut if you answer yes, or like not cut if you answer no. But I think you would define what the interest rates would mean, like, right? Um, and then not just what the Fed does, but like who the Fed, like what the Fed is to. Um, just like one quick sentence explanation for that. And then finally, will China become the biggest global superpower in the next 10 years? Anyway, this one's pretty clear. You have to define the biggest global superpower, like what makes someone the biggest global superpower, and this one's a little trickier to answer because you have to like take a multifaceted approach to it. One thing you could do is define it as three specific things, like that would make a global superpower, and then make your points centered around that. Is this making more sense on like how you can like frame the question around like um making it easier for you to answer in like the win scenario and like improve scenario, or in like B, how to define these terms?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Um, Next is a statement of significance, right? Or the SOS. Um, this is basically asking, why should I ask this question? Right? What's the benefit in me knowing? The judge, again, look it through their perspective. The judge is sitting there asking, like, I've heard these questions multiple times. They're all pretty important, but like, what makes one more important than the other? Why do I really care? I'll just be zoning out. I'll listen to your like speech a little bit. I'll like those judges are like annoying where they're just like, oh, I'll just count your sources and whoever has the most wins, or like, I just think you're the best speaker, so you win. They don't pay attention to your question. Um, but like your goal here is to really get the judge to pay attention. If you didn't get them in the attention getting device, you really have to draw their attention here. Like this is gonna be like that bombshell statement where it's like, look, like this is such a severe issue that we have to start caring about it now. It's like, wow, I need to start paying attention now. So what you want to do is add some statistics here. This is like um, a good opportunity to add a second source in your introduction. People do one source at least in their introduction. So be aware of that. Um, what you could do was like a jarring statistic, like what's it, like millions of people in America are not are uninsured, something like that. Like I don't know the exact number on the top of my head. You'd want an exact number to get most effect, but like make sure you have like a jarring statistic that like really shows how big the problem is, right? Because these problems we are talking about are like big problems, and you want to make sure we get that through to the judge. And so another way to implement that is like the use of your tone, right? In the 7 phases of Extemp, you'll talk about like, or like they're talking about like having different emotions like sad, hopeful, like devastated, angry, upset. So like what you want to do there is slow down and really show the severity of it. Or like if you're talking about nuclear war, then you want to get like kind of upset or like um, show like how problematic the situation could be. Okay, and then finally, this is where you could implement a second source. Some good sources to look at are like articles with like data in them, like any article basically works here. In like terms of international crises, a lot of like Council on Foreign Relations, like they have good information on this type of stuff. So be sure you look at that. All right, any questions on like the context or the statement of significance? No? All right, sounds good. Um, and then after the statement of significance, you would say the question word for word. This is really important because like when you have the actual question slips, your judges are going to have the question right in front of them. If you don't have the question slips, then like that's a different story. But like even in chat, like they can see the question. So make sure you don't mess that up. Second, make sure you answer the question. And one thing I'd like be aware of is like yes or no questions. Instead of just saying yes, you have to have an actual answer. Your answer, again, as Jimmy said yesterday in his lecture, is your answer cannot be the answer is threefold. Like threefold is not the answer, right? Like your answer is blank, right? Your answer is China is going to do blank. The United States foreign policy is going to suffer because blank. And then you have 3 points backing that thesis up. So that way it makes your speech a lot more structurally sound because then you have 3 points that are clearly linking to one answer rather than 3 points that are all attempting to answer the same question in 3 different ways. This makes your speech a lot more cohesive. Does anyone have any questions on that?
Wait, so if it's a yes or no question, then you would say yes, and then you would back it up with your 3 points that you delivered during the speech?
No, yes, but you want to say more than just yes. So like if for an example for like a yes and no question, let's see if we had one here. How's globalization improved the lives of the world's poorest citizens? You could say no, because the world's poorest citizens are only getting poorer and the population is increasing, which can be seen through first, second, and third. Or like you could say like a more general statement that was very, very specific. So like you could say more generally like no, because the world's poorest citizens are seeing a decrease in the quality of their lives, right? And then your 3 points back up why the answer is no and like why their life quality is decreasing. Does that make more sense?
Yes, that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, so don't just stop at yes or no. All right, any questions about the structure of the introduction in general now? Now, this is all making sense now? Okay, good. And then finally, we're going to do one last time. Let's try to identify the structure here. This is Olivia Shoemaker. I think she got second this year at Nationals. The speech on Venezuela. So let's try to find the structure here. Is everyone ready? Okay. Let's go to assume that is a yes.
After allegations of sexual harassment were dropped, Bill Cosby started hosting local forums on sexual assault. That's basically like the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro hosting a summit called Power to the People. An article by Foreign Policy explains on June 15th of 2017, Nicolas Maduro's government in Venezuela has become increasingly repressive throughout the course of their rule, not only undermining democracy, but undermining the potential for a strong Venezuelan economy. Indeed, the lack of economic diversification in Venezuela, as well as the mismanagement of natural resources like oil, have plunged the country into a desperate economic crisis, one that's lasted for over a year now. And the economic crisis is far from just an economic problem. It's one that's putting thousands of Venezuelans without food security, making it imperative that we're asking, what can be done to alleviate Venezuela's economic crisis? The answer is that the Maduro government must take meaningful economic reforms into its hands. First, by emboldening private corporations. Second, by paying back international creditors. And finally, by subsidizing agricultural products.
All right, so I don't know if you guys wrote anything down, but what was the AGD there? I mean, this was like the most clear thing.
It was a joke about Bill Cosby's like hosting a forum on sexual assault. It was as like ironic as if Maduro hosted a session on power to the people, like implying that Maduro is a dictator.
Yeah, I think like that's one of the greatest links from an AGD like of all time, right? Like that one worked so well because she literally said like that's like President Nicolas Maduro saying blank blank blank, right? It really connects it to the topic and bringing it back to Venezuela, although seemingly those two things could not be further apart, right? Like Maduro, you would not know how to connect to like Bill Cosby holding like forums on sexual assault. So yeah, any questions on the HED? I think that was really, really straightforward. What did we notice about the context then?
Gives like a background of like the economics situation in Venezuela, and how long it's been going on as well. She included that was like going on for over a year.
Exactly. So not only did she define like what an economic crisis would be, but also like specific to Venezuela, like, what happened, what went wrong, why it's continuing to go wrong, and then like what's happening right now currently. And then finally, what was like her SIG statement? Did anyone catch that? No one caught the statement of significance? Okay, the statement of significance there was that it's leaving millions without food security, right? And so it becomes imperative that we ask, right? So she goes, because like this economic crisis is leaving millions without food security, it becomes imperative that we ask, and that's the language you typically want to use in a significance statement. So most extempers will use, it's important that we ask today's question. It's imperative, it's critical that we ask today's question because of the significance that they've highlighted. Does that make more sense now? What the significance statement was?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. And then, of course, her question and answer and 3 points were there. All right, then any questions on the introduction in general? That's basically the lecture.
I have one question.
Yep.
So just earlier you were telling me about how you have to answer the question, but like also add on to that question so that way you can address your 3 points towards what your answer was. So I didn't catch what was her answer after she said, or what was her like?
Let's check.
Local forums on sexual assault. Nicolas Maduro's government in Venezuela has become increasingly repressive and plunged the country into a desperate economic crisis, one that's lasted for over a year now. And the economic crisis is far from just
hold on.
an economic problem. It's one that's putting thousands of Venezuelans without food security, making it imperative that we're asking, what can be done to alleviate Venezuela's economic crisis? The answer is that the Maduro government must take meaningful economic reforms into its hands.
Okay.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
So instead of just saying the Maduro government must first this, second this, third, the Maduro government must make meaningful economic reforms, which can be seen through 3 ways, right? Because then your 3 points, again, are trying to support that one answer you have. And like in the end, what that introduction does is that, like what that method of answering the question does is when the judge is reflecting back on the round, they remember like, look, this kid was the most convincing because they proved that their answer was correct because their 3 points supported one answer. Whereas like if their 3 points are like technically 3 separate answers, then in that case, the judge might be confused as like what exactly was the main point they were trying to convince of. Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? All right, sounds good.